I'm Claire Canada, and I'm Deputy Director of CGHE, based at UCL Institute of Education in London. I'm also Professor of Higher Education at Birkbeck College in London. So I'm really excited about today's seminar. We're going to be talking about, the title is Out of the Brexit Frying Pan and Into the Pandemic Fire. Tough times in UK higher education. And we've got three really eminent speakers who I'm delighted to introduce. And first of all, and the first person speaking will be Danny Dorling. Danny is a professor who works in the School of Geography and Environment at the University of Oxford. He works on issues to do with equality, employment, education, housing, and health. And he's a patron of the road crash charity, Road Peace, and of Healy City Farm in Sheffield. Our second speaker is Andy Westwood. Andy is Professor of Government Practice and Vice Dean in the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Manchester. He's a visiting Professor of Further and Higher Education at the University of Wolverhampton and the Governor of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. And finally, our third speaker is Jason Arday. Jason is an Associate Professor in Sociology at Durham University in the Department of Sociology. He's a visiting research fellow at the Ohio State University, an adjunct professor at Nelson Mandela University, and a trustee of the Runnymede Trust. So welcome to our speakers and welcome to you, our guests. Now, before handing over to Danny to kick it off, let's go through some protocols. So you'll note that the session is being recorded. And the recording will be placed on the CG website, and we'll give you the link in due course in the chat function. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the duration, and also you can turn off your cameras. However, if you are asked, if your question is selected, then we'd very much like you to turn on your camera and your speaker to ask your question. Now, questions need to be placed in the chat function, and that icon is at the bottom of the screen. And just so it's sort of more pleasant for you, you might want to turn on the speaker view, which is in the right-hand corner of your screen, so that you can see in full detail the person who is speaking. So I'm going to turn over and present the room to Danny. Danny, over to you.
Thank you so much. I've set my timer going. I've got 8 minutes. So there's a few things I wanted to say. The first thing to say is that obviously we're not out of the Brexit frying pan. And in fact, the two things, the pandemic and Brexit, are in some ways very related. The reason they're related is that the major reason we're having a lockdown imposed on us on Thursday is that the NHS cannot cope. The NHS, as you may well know, failed in 2015. The Red Cross called it to have failed in 2017. And in 2018, again, we had a very large number of deaths, and each of these times we had to stop routine operations. So the NHS has been doing very badly in normal times, let alone with a pandemic. The NHS relies on unusual numbers of staff from the EU who are not UK citizens. In particular, in cities such as the centre of London, a third of certain groups of staff are EU but not UK citizens. Why does this matter as we enter lockdown? We've got, 8 weeks to go and no deal? Would you stay here if you're not holding a British passport right now? So Brexit is still crucially important. But to surpass themselves, the government showed that they could handle a pandemic even worse than they could handle Brexit negotiations, which is where we are. And one other thing to say briefly is that higher education in England in particular that has problems because it was mainly privatised just 8 years ago. Only 8 years since we've had £9,000 a year fees, essentially government disengagement. On your own, the market system matters, and so on. And that is very, very unique in Europe and very, very odd. What do students think of the pandemic? ONS did a survey of the whole population from the 14th to the 18th of October. And this is their summary of what students think. 42% of students said that they weren't worried about COVID, or they were ambiguous about it, which, given their age group, kind of makes some sense of the age that most students are. 30% were somewhat worried, and 18%, 1 in 6, were very worried. And in a sense, you might get an idea this is a bit like the population as a whole. You'll know people who are extremely worried, you'll know people who are ambivalent. And depending on whether you're worried or ambivalent, you will think that the people who are ambivalent are just careless, or you'll think that the people who are extremely worried are paranoid, and so on. And all I'll say on that is that age is absolutely crucial above everything else. We've never seen a disease other than, say, Alzheimer's, so affected by age. Sorry, if you're doing your adding up, another 10% of students didn't know whether they're worried or not, or were somewhat unworried. Can't believe somebody will tick a somewhat unworried box, but anyway, there they are. Half of all students live at home, or they say they do when they were surveyed. Asked by ONS what they would do if they had the symptoms of COVID, only 39% said they would get a test. So the majority of university students, when asked by ONS, sample was small, I should say, the majority basically said they wouldn't get a test, just let it happen. 25% said that they'd let their university know, don't know whether they would or not, and only half said they would self-isolate if they had the symptoms. So what's interesting is we've got a group of relatively, on average, young people who, majority of whom are not that worried and would not rush to get a test and would not self-isolate that much among themselves. And so the outbreaks that we saw in universities, but first of all, Eton, it's really important we remember that Eton had the first big outbreak. And traditionally, Eton does this in pandemics in Britain. It's on the record. They spread it. What does the science say? And the science is not SAGE or independent SAGE. They are a group of people. The science is what is published in scientific journals, preferably papers that are refereed. Now, this may annoy you, but I can only find one refereed paper on what the science says, published in the British Medical Journal on the 15th of September. The title of the paper was The Effect of School Closures on Mortality from Coronavirus 2019, Old and New Predictions. And it wasn't just schools they looked at universities. And the conclusion is that they confirmed that by adding school and university closures, along with case isolation and household quarantine and social distancing of over 70s, this would lead to more deaths compared to the equivalent scenario without closures of schools and universities. Keeping universities open increases the number of cases. Keeping schools open increases the number of cases. But the modelling that was published in the BMJ on the 15th of September said that if you were to close schools or you were to close universities, you will have more deaths overall. Now, you may or may not disagree with this. We've all become epidemiologists. You might say, how can that be? And the reason about how it can be is that if students pass it amongst themselves, get it, and have a degree of immunity, nobody is absolutely immune or not immune, a degree of immunity, then when they do return to their family, many of whose members will be older, they're less likely to catch the disease and pass it to them or to have it. And so that's the modelling. The claim being made in the BMJ on the 15th of September is keeping universities open would reduce the total number of deaths. And it's quite important to understand that. Age matters. As you said at the beginning, I'm a trustee of Road Peace, the charity against road traffic accidents. A few weeks ago, on the edge of Oxford, there was a car involved in a car accident. 3 children died between the ages of 1 and 9 in that one car accident. 3 children between the ages of 1 and 9. That's 1 child more than all the children between 1 and 9 who died of COVID this year. Just to give you an idea about how much age matters. For young people in Britain, the greatest risk to them is still cars and crossing the road, and then mental ill health and so on. And I think you probably have to go through over 100 different causes of death, if you include all the possible cancers people can get, before you'd get COVID as a risk. That's for mortality. We do not yet know long COVID because you need time. You can't tell what the effects of long COVID will be if you haven't had a year to see whether it lasts a year or not. But all forms of disease have a long form. The equivalent for road traffic accidents, road traffic crashes, is not dying, but being severely injured. They all have that. Universities are in an incredible pickle at the moment. They have been ordered, despite the fact they're private institutions, to do certain things, and their market position means they do not have much chance to do anything else. I have 20 seconds left, so let me just read you part of the Minister of State for Universities letter, dated 2nd of November, yesterday, sent out to most students in Britain today, which says, "Dear students, I understand the questions that many of you may have following the Prime Minister's announcement on Saturday. Things have moved quickly, apparently, but I wanted to write you now. We're in the process of finalising guidelines. This is 2 days before the lockdown happens, but we're going to keep universities open because we're prioritising education, so there's no gap in your academic journeys and your lives." I suspect if the minister has had any advice, it is actually the number of deaths will be reduced if we keep you at university. The letter goes on, but the second page of the letter then says, if you're not at all happy, you can complain, and then lists all the ways in which students can complain to the Office of the Independent Adjudicator and the Office of Students and so on and so on. So whatever else happens to universities, they'll be dealing with an enormous number of complaints from students who've been told by the minister, do not leave your campus until the end of term, or at least not until the 2nd or 3rd of December. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Danny. That's absolutely brilliant. And thank you for sticking to time. Okay, Andy, you've got this one to beat in terms of time.
I'll do my best. And thankfully,
Danny's
already mentioned the letter, so that saves me 20 seconds of having a go at it. One of the worst letters I think I've ever read. But, so that's good. Thanks for asking me to come and speak, and hopefully this will be useful. There's a bit of feedback? Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, I'll carry on. So like Danny, I wanted to start with the NHS, given the lockdown that's approaching this week, and I wanted to start with what Chris Cook said about the NHS at the beginning of the pandemic, back in March, April, when he was writing about the state of the NHS on Tortoise, and I kind of recommend both Tortoise and this particular article from Chris to everybody if they've not read it. But in it, he coined the term the fragile state. And what he was essentially talking about was the fragility and the lack of resilience in the NHS, and the impacts of 10, 20 years of competition, market-orientated reform, new public management theory, driving efficiency and productivity in the NHS, and as a kind of consequence of all of those things, a situation where the NHS had a lower number of beds than many other countries in Europe, certainly a much smaller number of intensive care beds, less ventilators, really kind of fragile numbers and a fragile supply of staff, doctors, nurses, etc. A lack of PPE, fragile supply chains delivering not just PPE but ventilators and all the rest of it. And this as it turned out was not a great way for a health service to enter a pandemic. It doesn't feel like, as we enter the second lockdown, the NHS is in any better a state. But I think this notion that Chris talked about, this idea of a fragile state, I think is something that we can apply equally to universities. So, you know, that's partly about Brexit, but more specifically about its experience during the pandemic. And for us, that fragility, driven by exactly the same things: efficiency, productivity, kind of a faith in value for money, that has kind of created an environment where we are kind of, you know, utterly driven by competition, market pressure, a need to maximize recruitment, maximize finances, cross subsidies so that we can pay for expensive things like research, and to kind of cram people into quite expensive halls in order to make kind of the whole model stack up. And like the NHS, it doesn't feel like the best way to organise an essential and important kind of set of institutions in the run up to and the experience of a pandemic. By the way, it almost certainly won't be the best way to run a set of important institutions when we come to try and recover from the pandemic too. So it's that kind of fragility that I wanted to kind of set as a sort of context for my comments. But there are a few areas that I think kind of that leads us to, both observations on the system, but also observations on kind of the policy framework and where it's failing. So the first is the residential model, you know, where the real pressure, the real kind of issues of COVID have been felt. You know, this has expanded massively over the last 10 years in that period that Danny's just described. It's become much more dominant. As you will know, Claire, kind of in your role at Birkbeck, we've seen kind of the size of the full-time young residential population grow at the expense of part-time study, of people following non-honours degrees in different parts of the HE system. In other words, our sector has become more and more homogenised, not just as a business model, but also in the way we provide and deliver higher education around that young full-time model. It means we've got the youngest average age graduates in the OECD and the costliest. And neither of those feels like a great place to be in the kind of in the moment that we are in. Second thing I wanted to point out was, which is in the kind of in the notes around the seminar, which is this notion of a kind of, you know, what has this done to the student compact, the relationship, the contract, psychological or legal between students and their universities. Well, it turns out that it's put it under a huge amount of pressure. There are only certain things you can deliver online. Campus security, mental health support, things like that aren't as deliverable online as some aspects of teaching and learning have been possible to do. And that kind of, you know, that crushing of the experience into very, very full halls of residence obviously exacerbate all of those things. A third area of tension, I think, which is going to be really problematic for us, is around the civic role and the relationship between universities and their places. I'm in Manchester for the first time in many months, but here in Manchester in September, 55% of infections in September, as it was going through the roof, were students. You know, that is a hell of a kind of, a hell of an issue in both public health terms, but also kind of the relationship between a place and an institution going forward. Now, you know, the Civic University Commission did some fantastic work on what and how universities could contribute more and think more about their place. But, you know, that I think is going to be under real pressure if, you know, if both kind of, you know, this term is anything to go by, but the return to campus next term and so on while the pandemic kind of continues. The fourth thing I want to touch on really was the policy framework and the absolute obvious statement that it's been suboptimal. You know, with a regulatory model embodied by OFS and HERA that already feels out of time. It felt out of time with a government that wanted to be active and do levelling up and invest in science and in some courses rather than other courses. And I think the pandemic has kind of really shown it's not the best way to run a system, to be so kind of hands-off, so market orientated, and so obsessed with outcomes and the quality of delivery, which again takes us back to Donnellan's letter. I have to say, the Bayes side of the house is slightly better. I think kind of, you know, their tone and their approach to universities has been kind of rather more thoughtful and thought through, and less aggressive, and less just less bad. But DFE have been way off the pace, I think, and found wanting. You know, we've had a summer of the A-level problem, which created even more pressures for university, a kind of a bailout regime, which pushed more universities into maximising numbers and income, and away from a regime when actually, like other sectors, it could have been much more supportive. We're waiting, as Danny said, for guidance that never seems to arrive. We've got a department that does not seem able to join up with crucially important things, not just R&D and Bayes and how that affects universities, but also DWP and the employment agenda, going to be huge for graduates. I'll come back to that in a second, and that place agenda that in England is owned by CLG. My sort of final point is this. You know, there are some reasons to be optimistic, I think, about universities. They're likely to become more and more important when we eventually get round to tackling regional inequality, productivity, increasing R&D and innovation. And you know, and civically, we're going to become more and more important of how all of those things come together to renew places, and they desperately need renewing, many of them. But the pressures that we need to tackle before we get to that place are huge. The short-term instability, short to medium-term instability from COVID, longer-term fragility, going back to that kind of notion of fragility, political and kind of policy uncertainty, pensions, a fragile funding system that, you know, as Danny said, is only 8 years old, but is very unlikely to survive the next few years, because the whole graduate repayment system isn't going to endure in a weak economy with reducing employment opportunities, pressure on graduate wages, and therefore kind of pressure on the system that essentially is funding universities in the current moment. So I think it's much more likely to fall over than it is to stay upright. And you put all that together, as well as the continuing kind of culture wars that are swirling around from Brexit, and it looks like it's going to be a very, very challenging period, not just while COVID kind of continues, but certainly in the kind of, you know, in what looks like it's going to be a fairly lengthy return or restoration of the economy and society, just, you know, from just a few months ago. So strap in, I think, is the last phrase I would leave you with.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. That's great, and plenty of issues there to think about. Finally, and now, can I hand over to Jason? Over to you, Jason.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much. It's an absolute privilege to be here again. Thank you so much, Simon, for the invitation. Great to be here with Danny and Andy, and yourself, Claire, as well. And Trevor, thank you for all the work you're doing in the background as well. In terms of, I guess, COVID, the pandemic, whatever kind of words people have used to describe what we're going through at the moment, you know, the global economy in many respects is in a state of flux. It's a really kind of precarious situation where, you know, as kind of Danny and Andy have touched upon, kind of with some statistical narratives and kind of how this is playing out within universities, it has been problematic. I guess the kind of globalization or the kind of marketization of the academy also kind of plays into that, and a lot of universities are in it financially, could be a precarious situation. And we kind of think about a lot of the work that's come out in London, particularly from the Institute of Fiscal Studies, that was kind of centered around 3 or 4 months ago, the first university to potentially go out of business. And there's kind of been, you know, 4 or 5 universities that have been touted as potentially not going to be able to survive the next 2 to 3 years based on the shortfall of students they would have and the financial implications of that. I guess what I want to focus my kind of next 5 minutes on is really thinking about kind of a few issues that I think are quite prevalent in terms of who the pandemic will affect. It obviously affects everyone, but in terms of kind of the socio-economic structure we reside within, it's thinking about, I guess, things at a more, dare I say it, grassroots level. So, you know, in the first instance, one of the things that I kind of think about is this across the intersection. So what does this kind of look like in terms of the representation around issues of class, potentially disability, you know, race, etc. And I guess one of the things that becomes really concerning is if we think about the kind of current university system and model, globally speaking, and if we particularly think about the UK, it was very difficult for non-traditional students. And when we use the term non-traditional, I guess we're talking about students particularly from, you know, in terms of how we conceptualize that, students that might be from white working class backgrounds, or from Black and ethnic minority backgrounds, who are kind of classed within that aspect of, or that vernacular of kind of non-traditional, and access and pathways to that. And before we kind of were in this pandemic, there were some issues around these issues anyway, but I guess they become conflated because of the pandemic. So in terms of when we think about what happened this summer, how have some of these students, for example, how have they been able, you know, we think about the disadvantages that they face within, in many respects, an already inequitable education system, and how those students been affected in terms of getting into, oh, hello, sorry, getting into university spaces. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry, let me sorry, very long. In terms of getting into university spaces. And for me, one of the things that's kind of really interesting with that is kind of thinking about how students potentially were disadvantaged by, you know, the kind of mode of travel that was taken in terms of the grades, and how that affected, for many working class students, having their destiny in their own hands. Effectively, that ability to kind of create their own destiny was very much taken away from them and used against, and was kind of, I guess, referenced against, you know, a teacher's set of kind of algorithms in terms of how they thought a student may do. And what we have seen, I guess, is a real disadvantaging of, you know, particularly working class students who have had that destiny taken away from them. And if we know that there are, you know, particularly conduits or particular kind of disadvantages and barriers around non-traditional students accessing or getting into elite institutions, this would have further exacerbated that. And if we draw on the work of kind of Professor Vicky Bolivar, particularly around kind of UCAS and entry requirements, and how kind of these complicit biases come in many respects, this situation has facilitated the, you know, that kind of complacency ensuing, you know, in terms of that marginalization, and almost kind of being able to sit within a policy and legal framework, kind of, I guess, led by the government we have around this. So that is quite interesting in terms of framing that. In terms of contract precarity, I think this becomes really, really important. And I think what this is exacerbated, if nothing else, are the types of people within the academy that occupy precarious contracts. And I think this kind of really sheds a light on, I guess, the inequity of the academy, particularly in terms of representation and diversification. And what we have noticed is a huge amount of people on precarious contracts are Black and ethnic minority staff. And in COVID times, universities will obviously be kind of hanging their, you know, trying to reach their basket where they can hang it. So there's going to be an adjusting of finances, which invariably is going to continue to disadvantage a very small minority, particularly within the global academy. But if we kind of focus on a UK context, that make up only 14% of the actual university workforce within this country in terms of academic. So that's quite a very small percentage. If we then kind of think about the pressure on universities and we think about university governance, modes of leadership are having to change. And in many respects, while you might use a 5 to 7 year strategic plan to forecast where the directional focus and travel of the university will go, universities have now had to be quite reactive, because we're working in the context that is changing day in, day out, day in, day out. And so that kind of impacts things around how we conceptualize leadership. You know, I've kind of been really mindful to think about, you know, in my head, I'm kind of thinking, I've been probably quite critical in my head of university leaders and kind of how they can manage the situation better. But, you know, if we have a government that doesn't know what to do from one day to the next, then it's probably quite unreasonable of me to think, okay, well, university leaders should be able to forecast X, Y, and Z. That in itself is unreasonable. It's interesting that we kind of think about how that breaks down. One of the last kind of points I want us to kind of think about is really the impact on online learning. And I guess there is a technology or digital deficit, or in terms of people, you know, and I talk about, you know, if we look at this from a socio-economic model, people being able to access, and it may seem like a simple thing, but a laptop, you know, thinking about a laptop, being able to access online lectures, the mediums through which people might need to use, you know, not being able to access ebooks, you know, and there are all of these things in terms of that do reside around, you know, economic capital. And there are students that may not have that. And, you know, the physical act of being in a university space in itself is very different to then having to mobilize, I guess, funds to maybe be part of that. And while universities have been really good by and large at responding and trying to, I guess, reduce this deficit, it is important to acknowledge that it is there and it does impact learning. Not to mention, if we think about the ways in which learners will have different forms of neurodivergence and how that impacts on this context as well, in terms of how they learn and online learning as a mechanism, and the modes of assessment that we might be using, the different types of intervention that we might engage in terms of pedagogical interventions. And there's all of those kind of things, I guess, to unpack and consider, and how we refine that instrument going forward, because I guess for the foreseeable future, this may be the new normal, for want of a better term. So it's really thinking about across the piece how we manage all of those issues, because I think they're fluctuating every day and they're changing daily. So I think that's it for me. Thank you so much for listening, and look forward to hearing people's kind of comments and engaging with everybody. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Jason. That's great, that's lovely. So everybody has behaved incredibly well. So we've got lots of time for questions, so please put your questions in the chat function. But let's start off with a question from Richard Budd. Richard, what's your question?
Hi, yeah.
Unmute, thanks.
Hi, yeah. This is, I guess, primarily for Andy, but I'd also be really interested to hear what both Danny and Jason would be able to say about this. So if, as you predict, the current finance system is likely to fall over, if it is unsustainable, not just because of the pandemic, but also because of kind of employability and payback rates, of course it depends on who's in government, but what replaces it? And the question then is, what are the implications for social justice? Because in a way, the obvious outfall would be that all of the high-ranked universities are high and dry, the lower-ranked universities go to the wall, and then the effect that has on essentially particularly non-traditional students, and then, you know, academic progression, the whole thing just goes, in a way, steps back 40 years. I mean, that's worst case scenario, right? So what would replace it, do you think, and what would the impact be across the sector? Sorry, big question.
Yeah, several questions, but let me, I mean, all good ones. I mean, I think until the 3-year spending review was postponed, I think, you know, the likelihood of a tertiary white paper responding to Augur looked fairly likely. So it looked like the government was going to try and answer that question at least a little bit this autumn. That as far as I can tell, doesn't look anywhere near as likely now, but it's certainly going to still be in the back of their minds. And I guess, you know, their very well sort of publicised approach is to rebalance across HE and FE, which would have some of those consequences that you describe within the HE sector. But I guess the argument is that kind of, you know, boosting FE comes at social justice in a different way. I mean, I'm not saying I agree with that. I would certainly agree with funding FE a hell of a lot better and encouraging more part-time and adult learning in both FE and HE. But that whole tertiary reboot looks rather less likely. I think it's also telling that you know, at the moment, as far as I understand it, some of the most popular books in education policy in the government are Michael Sandel and David Goodhart, who are both having a kick against meritocracy and mass higher education. So, you know, I guess the sort of the response that if it does appear in this parliament is a smaller sector, a more varied sector with some of those pressures on institutions that you say, but a greater kind of a greater investment and attention to the FE and technical routes. Now, you know, there are lots of there's lots of details and lots of pros and cons there, but certainly amongst the cons are the extra pressure on both people and institutions, and by the way, places where those institutions tend to be. But I do think kind of it's up for grabs really, and it's just as much up for grabs for opposition parties. You know, what would they do? What levers do they want? What are the outputs that they want from a system? In the same way that the Conservative Party are thinking about that in England, I think it's equally true that the administrations in Wales and Scotland are thinking about a system that they want to kind of create in the longer term. But I'll stop there.
Great, thank you. Danny, do you want to add and comment? Yeah, unmute yourself, Danny. Danny.
As far as I'm aware, Labour Party, I think the Liberal Party, the Green Party and the SNP are still all opposed to student loans and fees. And just because the Conservative Party support them, you know, I really don't think we should think they have a high shelf life. On the idea that without them, high-ranked universities will benefit, we often don't see the ways in which high-ranked universities disbenefit the areas in which they're based. I'll just give you one example from mine, and I promise not to talk about Oxford again. The most common way in which young people in this city die is homeless. People who I went to school with who are dead now have died on the streets of Oxford or in halfway houses as homeless. Why are they dying as homeless? To put it crudely, because the two universities of the city have taken all the flats. So expansion of universities at the top actually can really damage the towns and the people in the local area. And you can add on to that, you know, it's called the University of Oxford, but you could call it the University of Heathrow, given how many students, particularly postgrads for the majority, fly in. Now that's not a very robust model in a time of pandemic. So I wouldn't think necessarily that universities at the top of a hierarchy should benefit from a new system in particular, and it doesn't benefit the towns in which they are in for them to carry on expanding to the point of people actually dying on the street because they have too many students in a town with too few bedrooms.
Right, Jason, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just briefly to add to Professor Budd's point, in terms of the social justice element of it, I think one of the things that I do worry about is the survival of I guess, you know, a lot of post-92 universities and all of this. And, you know, sadly, rightly or wrongly, what the event of the summer in terms of students actually really, it worked to the advantage of the elite institutions in many respects. And obviously the people that suffered from that, I think, were the post-92s in many respects. And it's kind of, I don't know how, again, because Professor Budd brought up the issue of social justice, you kind of think how do those riches, if you will, how do they get cascaded across the sector? I don't like the word downwards because it suggests hierarchy, but how does it get cascaded across the sector? Because that is something that the idea of a university going out of business that hugely serves or you know, is a massive center point of a community is something that I do worry about that, because for a lot of individuals from that particular geographical area, you know, that may be the only opportunity to actually become socially mobile in the context of which we understand it. So I do worry about that, and how, from a social justice point of view, how that might work going forward. And it is worrying, because then there's also massive implications around jobs, around students, you know, not having a home, in inverted commas, and all the other things that kind of go around that. And obviously the infrastructure and the finance that that institution brings to a local area.
Right, good. Indeed, I think figures published yesterday or today or whenever it was suggesting that actually in terms of WP students, there's basically been no difference, or there's been a 1% increase. I mean, nothing, absolutely negligible. So, yeah, that tells us a lot, despite potentially, however you want to interpret the summer debacle over grading, potentially advantaging the most disadvantaged students. So despite that, that's not having any impact on numbers as far as I can see. Rosemary Dean, I think she'd like to ask a question in relation to the original question posed.
Yes, it was really to say that, I mean, it isn't true that the whole of the UK has a marketised higher education system, because Scotland has one that has some degree of marketisation, but it's organised very, very differently. And apart from probably Edinburgh and St Andrews, even universities like Glasgow have a very, very high proportion of students who live at home. So some of the kind of residential model doesn't affect them in the same way. But on the other hand, the Scottish system has been through quite a lot of problems because it's short of money. So I suppose the question is, how on earth do you move from a system that kind of threw away the kind of the notion that the government should pay for anybody to go into higher education virtually in the kind of at the turn of the kind of first decade of the 21st century? How do you go back then to a totally different system? Who is it we want to be in it? And is it time to kind of drop the notion of full-time education? Because I think for an awful lot of working class students in particular, they aren't really full-time, even if they're theoretically full-time, and haven't been for some years because they're busy earning money in order to be able to stay there. So that, you know, I think this is a question about, is there a model in Scotland? Is that not the model we want to follow? In which case, what model do we want to follow if we want to do something different? And how likely is it that we can get there in the next, well, probably even 10 years?
Okay, so which one of you would like to take that first? Andy?
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, Rosemary's absolutely right, of course, to say that you know, a lot of things we talked about were about the English system rather than the Scottish, Welsh, or Northern Irish system. And although the Welsh system has changed a bit in its kind of diamond reforms, basically both Scottish and Welsh systems have been quite different and have diverged quite a lot from the approach in England. I think there have been some of the same tensions between FE and HE and kind of resource being sucked upwards rather than into that. But I think what's quite interesting, the two questions that I think are interesting when we look at Wales and Scotland and what England might move to. One is that I think that there are English policymakers who look to Wales and Scotland and think, I wish we had that much influence over what universities did. Which the marketisation actually sucked away from, when Hefty disappeared, ministers could pull less levers with the OFS and the kind of high funding model that they can still pull in Scotland and Wales. I think the broader question about, how do you go to something that resembles something that might have more Welsh and Scottish characteristics, which, as I say, I think might be quite appealing in that way to English ministers. I think ultimately you pay for the things that you want, and one of the reasons why our sector has homogenised so much in England is because the funding available for both individuals and for institutions has been so lopsided towards the full-time residential model that that's what we've ended up with. And if you want to redress that, you have to, and there've now been tons of reports that have kind of pointed this out, that if you want to restore diversity, want to kind of make more people go to a local university or a local FE college, or to study FE, or to study non-honours degree, level 4-5, you have to put the resources there, both for individuals and for institutions to respond to it. And that's the biggest single lesson. If there's other stuff you want from a system, then you have to pay for it, basically.
Thank you. Danny, do you want to add anything?
Just as far as I'm aware, no Scottish university is facing bankruptcy. So it's obviously a far more stable system, but it is the system of the majority of Europe. That is simply how you do it. Basing a system on a lie that you will be earning a very large amount of money as a graduate in future, you know, it's you can do it for a short amount of time, and particularly in a way, the pandemic allows it to carry on for a bit longer because there's nothing else to do at 18 when people aren't being taken on for work. But what happens when people say, what was my degree actually worth? Some reports about debt, national reports about debt this summer, showed that recent graduates were in a far worse position than people who had chosen not to go to university at 18 in recent years. Recent university graduates were more likely to becoming unemployed as the unemployment began to rise because they were doing jobs which were more precarious in England. So, you know, this is coming to an end. But I don't, the current government will believe in trying to create a small and elite system because they come from small and elite places, and having education for the lower orders as they see them, which is lower funded. It would be amazing if they didn't do that. As you know, you don't join a Conservative Party if you believe in equality, to put it very bluntly.
Right. Jason, is there anything you'd like to add?
I have nothing to add other than what Andy just said is absolute gospel in my opinion. that last bit. You don't join the Conservative Party if you, yeah. I obviously I probably shouldn't be saying that, but yeah, I concur that. That's a resounding. My head was like, yeah, that registers with me as well. So I agree.
Right. Okay, Colin McCrae. Okay, would you like to ask your question, Colin?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. Okay, I just wonder what the panel think the response to the pandemic means for the concept of institutional autonomy that we hear so much about. In the early summer, when lots of people were concerned about the qualification fiasco and so on, some of us market watchers, if you like, were all waiting decisions about whether institutions would offer face-to-face teaching in the autumn or online only, some sort of blender of the two formats. And there was a date, I think it was sometime in late June, when Bolton and Cambridge, both on the same day, actually announced a blended approach. Funny enough, Cambridge got a bigger media splash for that. But anyway, pretty soon afterwards, most of the sector followed suit. And I remember reading somewhere that 97% of institutions were all offering this face-to-face, with but some of it blended. But at the time, I don't remember government expressing a view. But yes, since we've gone into the sort of second wave, university leaders are now sort of obviating the blame and almost saying they had to keep on with face-to-face. We've had to insist students stay on campus because the government insists on it. So what happened to this autonomy that we keep hearing about? It's been used to deny post-qualification admission system. It's been used to argue against contextualized admissions. It's been used to argue against credit accumulation and transfer over the years. It's used as a reason not to widen participation to people below 3As, for example, in some of the more elite institutions. So what happened to autonomy if universities, like schools, are actually under government fiat?
Danny, go for it.
Okay, that's a very, very good question. I happen to believe that universities should be under government fiat, because when I look at universities in other mainland European countries, where in a sense university staff are civil servants, where PhD students are often members of staff, I just see something of so much dramatically higher quality. The problem with a marketized system such as the one we have in England, it's not quite as bad as the extremes in the United States, where they spend more money on marketing than on teaching. But in the US, they did have Trump universities. And the danger of the system we have in England is that we'll spend an enormous amount of money on our complaint procedures, particularly now the minister has told students to complain if they're not at all happy. And the university which has the most efficient complaint procedure will do well. We will, of course, dash the hopes and worries and concerns of 18, 19-year-olds when they say, look, I've been shut in this imprisoned room for weeks and weeks. And it's terrible. And we should just look to the European mainland, and we should look to how the universities work. Some autonomy, academic freedom is good, but ultimately a good university system is funded by the state, and the state has to have some control over that. And we have all kinds of models on the mainland which are so much better than the model that we're running at the moment, particularly in England.
Andy, do you agree?
I think to an extent. I mean, I certainly don't fear the kind of models of government control that exist in places like Germany, for example, and so and other European systems where the state is more active, but it's also probably the state is more stable in what it wants from a system, particularly in somewhere like Germany, and obviously that would sit across FEHE and research as well. But I think, I think the point, Colin's question is a great one, because autonomy only ever rears its head in weird, unpredictable circumstances. And I think, I talked a lot about the homogeneity of provision, but looking at English universities, I could be making the same point about homogeneity of strategy. Everybody kind of does a version of the same thing. And that has become kind of more and more obvious as we've entered. It might be a market for good or bad, but it's a very narrow market with very narrow strategies, and institutions are very, very reluctant, it seems to me, to use their autonomy to think strategically differently about who they are, what they do, and how they do it. So I think autonomy in that context often feels like a bit of a false flag raised in arguments where it kind of might make an impact, but overall, in terms of the way universities operate and the way they operate strategically, I think actually what we see is much more of a compliant model that seems to kind of go along with the wishes of the state, and over the last few years, as expressed through the kind of all the things that we talked about in our opening remarks.
Right. Jason, is there anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, just briefly to add to Danny and Andy's comments, I think the infringements on autonomy, I think, were becoming more and more and more anyway before COVID. I think there was almost a strangulation of autonomy in terms of what people could do at universities, and the kind of proliferation of more and more responsibilities against poorer workload models, against fixed term contracts, and there was kind of an exploitation. It's been leaning towards that way for the last decade, due to, I guess, the marketization of the sector within the last 8 to 10 years. I think in terms of the idea of autonomy, I think while we're still in this kind of process of flux, I think it lends itself to autonomy being exploited and manipulated in varying ways, and actually people then relying on goodwill, and really exploiting goodwill, because fundamentally academics, practitioners, educated professional staff are going to do everything they can to keep the machine going in many respects, if we think about it at a more localized level in terms of our institutions. And I think in terms of that aspect of autonomy, it's been threatened for a long time. I think what this gives potentially, without being cynical, senior leaders an opportunity to do is to kind of utilize or exploit that within the kind of context of COVID, where it's kind of needs to be all hands on deck. So it's me being a bit cynical, but I think fundamentally there were infringements on autonomy for several years, and now really there's almost a license to do it, because we all kind of need to be participative in trying to make this work as best as possible.
Good. Okay, the next question is from Amit Kumar Bali. Would you like to come in? Lost him. Amit? Okay. Well, I'll ask a question then. So this is to Danny. I mean, Danny, you talked about the relationship between Brexit and the NHS. From where you're sitting, what about the relationship between Brexit and HE in terms of staffing?
We were doing extremely well out of staffing some of our universities from people from the European mainland in particular. There was a point once when I was on the governing body, and I realised a third of the people, mainly the younger academics there, had not been born in England, and most were mainland European. I think there's a sense in which, as we've driven down standards over what we actually do, we have the youngest graduates, we give out a lot of degrees, we don't necessarily produce as many people who can be academics from England, but we can simply import them from the rest of the world. It's an amazing model. While it's good, the money comes in. But having put ourselves in a situation where we're going to make people second-class citizens if they come here, it's going to be harder. Switzerland does manage to do this. That's the only thing I'll say. Switzerland, the Swiss universities, it's one of the few places in the world where English people can realise what it's like to be an immigrant when you don't have the same rights as other people that you work with in Switzerland. So it is possible to have that model, but it's not a particularly sensible model, and it's also extremely dangerous. Selling yourself on your ability to market yourself and on branding, rather than actually how good you really are, or how many languages your students can speak when they graduate and how good they are at maths and so on. We don't like to talk about that. It is a dangerous thing to do. And the last thing to add on this with the pandemic is all this distance learning that's going on now, all this Zooming and so on, means that thousands and hundreds of thousands of lectures are being recorded. You can simply tick your phone on, record a lecture, and before you know, it's on the Dispatch's documentary of I'm paying £9,250 for this. The interviews to come in, I wouldn't mention it again, but the interviews to get into my university will all going to have to be done online in a few weeks' time. Anybody can record with a remote device being asked, what is it about the University of Oxford that makes you think that you should come here, dear child, or whatever somebody asks. So the scope for blowing apart the kind of myth of what a wonderful thing a British elitist university education is very high. The sensible thing is do good education, don't sell something that isn't good, and mainly your university education should be for people in your own state. We don't need Swiss finishing schools for the elite of the world and the sons and daughters of Chinese factory owners to come to give them some kind of cachet. It's just dangerous as a financial model, let alone whether it's immoral.
And what about actual staff, though? I mean, why is it that it appears that the European postdocs are so much more attractive?
There's a long-term effect, I think, of having been the biggest empire the world has ever known, and we underestimate that. A very similar question is asked about why do people come all the way from Eritrea and Ethiopia, places that were not even colonies of the empire, across the Sahel, risk drowning on the Mediterranean, get all the way to France, to get in a dinghy, to come to what is a pretty god-awful place to end up for. And if you're English, you know, and we've lived off this. We used to live off an empire, you know, until the 60s and 70s. We made an awful amount of money from an empire that we never recognized. That's how we made money. Now we're partly living off a legacy of an empire. The English language, fun. There is also attractiveness of inequality. It has to be said that when you talk to people in what are often seen as utopias, Sweden and Finland and so on, who come to Britain, they do tend to say often, it's a bit boring where everything's so equal and predictable. I like London, it's fun. So we can sell ourselves partly on that. But, you know, and everybody's second language. But we're in a very, very dangerous position. Look at the United States. Look at how the reputation of the United States, which was already not particularly good, given how many wars the US was involved in. Look at how it's plummeted in 4 years. You know, with a question we're going to be asking over the next 24, 48, 90 hours will be, how can 40% of people vote for somebody who looks and behaves like that? Now, the next equivalent country, and it's the same in the ordering of pandemic deaths, is us. And one thing to think about, shut up, if Biden wins, Johnson's really going to look out of order, isn't he? You know, at the moment, Johnson doesn't look completely exceptional because of Trump. But if Joe Biden wins, you're left with Boris Johnson and our current government as a kind of sore thumb out there. It's not a safe basis for our children, for the economy, for the lives of selling it like this. I'm not saying it because I'm cynical. You know, I really want to see our towns and cities being nice places to live in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time. And I worry that selling degrees on the basis of marketing as your industrial model is as dangerous as it was to base an economy on finance and debt and derivatives as we did in 2008.
Well, thank you. Are there any concluding comments, Andy or Jason? And then
Can I say a quick thing about Brexit? I think, you know, we can divide up the sort of economic things that might happen. You know, the negotiations carry on, and we know very well what the kind of the pressures are, potential risks around students, staff, and kind of access to R&D. But we still don't know what's going to happen with those. We still don't know what the nature of that exit's going to be, though. That obviously we can speculate. The thing that we're dealing with now is all the identity stuff. It's the fact that kind of, you know, all the culture war stuff, all the fact that kind of, you know, universities and graduates were all seen on one side of that debate, very much remain kind of outward looking, all that stuff. And so, you know, some of that tension with government, with ministers, with policymakers kind of comes from that identity aspect of Brexit and the vote and a bit of an existential crisis that I think universities have found themselves in, particularly in places where, you know, they've looked around them and realised that, you know, vast swathes of the population that they live in and work amongst have voted one way and they've all voted another way. So, you know, so I think kind of, you know, we're absolutely dealing with all of that now and have been dealing with all of that since the referendum. The economic stuff, the actual kind of contractual stuff for you know, very, very, very important for people, for institutions, for R&D, you know, and all of that. We still don't know. You know, we still don't know where that's going to go.
okay, Jason, a final word.
Yeah, I'm mindful that I feel like maybe it's been a bit dour today. I just kind of want to end on a good point. I do think, if nothing else, we are learning new ways of working, and you know, I think this process in technological innovation is really useful in terms of how we think about, you know, working and operating as an academy going forward. And if things should ever return back to normal, God willing, then actually there's a lot of things that we've traditionally done that we can actually break the binaries of, because there are, you know, in terms of engagement, just like a platform like this, more people can engage because of this medium. Otherwise we'd be doing it in different ways. So for no other reason, I think hopefully the future presents something a bit more optimistic. And just thank you so much, Claire and Danny and Andy, for the privilege of being with you.
Well, thank you. Thank all three of you, Danny, Andy, and Jason. And next Thursday, we'll be having another seminar, which will be looking at issues to do with ableism in academia and theories of disability and chronic illness in higher education. It's a book symposium. So, you know, do join us later on in the week. And thank you once again to Danny, Andy, and Jason. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye.